Konstantin, I'm so happy to see you again. I'm so excited to talk to you. I just finished listening to your book, and I thought it was amazing. And you guys are blowing up all over the place, you and Francis. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's a real pleasure, Meghan. I look forward to catching up.
So how have things been going over on your end? I'm presuming you're pretty busy. You just got back from the States. What were your impressions over there? Did you have a good time?
Yeah, so I've had a baby, a book, and a trip to the US for 3 weeks in the space of about 3 months. So you can tell I'm a little bit worn out, but it was awesome. America was great. We were just talking before we started about what a great guy Joe Rogan is, which I think we both agree is true. And that the whole trip was really inspirational for us, particularly because in the UK we do have a bit of this sort of like tall poppy syndrome where you can't be seen to be like to want to do well. We couldn't possibly have this. Whereas in America, the refreshing thing is everyone's like, go for it. Oh, you're doing great. Brilliant. I'm doing this thing too. Let's work together. Let's do some stuff. So it was really exciting. It was interesting. I think last time you and I spoke was during COVID. And at that time we were genuinely very frustrated with everything that was happening here in the UK. And we were seriously thinking, like, where do we go that's not going to be like this? And so the trip to the US, and, Joe was sort of saying, I'm building a bit of a community of cool people here. Why don't you come and join? So we'll probably go over for another week or 10 days, shoot a few more interviews. And then the plan for us is maybe go over for a month or two early next year during the winter season and check out what Austin's like in the winter, whether we actually would like to be there.
That's awesome. I'm so excited to hear that. I mean, like I self-exiled to Mexico, but ironically, maybe not ironically, but I mean, it's much easier, much simpler, way cheaper for me to fly to the US than to Canada. I haven't been back to Canada in over a year now. But so I've been to Austin several times over the past year. I love it. It's an awesome city. The people there, like Texans, I think are amazing. And yeah, I love what's going on. Austin is amazing. The comedy scene, as I'm sure you've noticed, is great.
Yeah, we went to one of the shows that Joe does. And it was incredible because I stopped doing stand-up during the pandemic. When lockdown happened, it made me realize that the job I was doing was not having a good impact on my life in terms of, my relationship with my wife, my health, my overall well-being. Because a lot of stand-up is just, in the UK, you can't just like live in London and only gig in London. You have to travel all over the country. So my life was sort of like do a full day's work for Triggernometry, get in the car, drive for 2 hours, perform, get in the car, drive for 2 hours, get home at midnight, up at 8 the next day. And that was like my day every day. And, that doesn't leave a lot of time, but also a lot of sort of mental energy to be with your partner or to do other stuff or just to relax and be healthy and so on. So it was getting out of hand. And so I haven't done stand-up. I really haven't missed it because on Triggernometry, we do something we call a raw show, which is me and Francis joking around for an hour and a half, 3 nights a week, talking about the news, taking the piss out of each other, doing every outrageous accent under the sun. It's kind of very offensive, but very funny and playful and so on. So I get the outlet for my creative instincts, and I write my Substack, of course, as well. And I haven't missed stand-up. But when we went to Joe's club and I saw how free the guys were there to do the jokes that they want to do, I was like, maybe the joke coke is something I'd fancy another snort at, you know what I mean? So I had that feeling of like, yeah, because part of my frustration with comedy is, in addition to all the lifestyle stuff, was also that in the UK, it was getting to the point where it's like, you know, if you want to push any boundary at all, you have to build in 7 other jokes before and after, just for people to not to shit their pants every time you do a joke. So it was such a relief to go to his club and just see people literally, some of the jokes were too much even for me. I was like, whoa, but delighted that people are free to make them. You know what I mean? So it's exciting. And you say Texans. I mean, I hear that Austin is not necessarily that representative of Texas. I don't know if you managed to travel around that much and see the rest of it.
Not yet.
But Austin, I liked a lot, for sure.
Yeah. Well, Austin's like the most woke and the most hipster. I think the rest of Texas is actually not super like Austin. But I did find everybody that I met from Austin there and from Texas to be super nice and super friendly. And Joe sent us, like my partner and I went to see Kill Tony at the Vulcan, and it was so funny and great and very risque. Like, is that what did you guys go see when you were there?
We went to see, I think it was Joe doing an hour, and he had a few. Tony was one of the people who opened for him. Theo Von was there, Hans Kim as well. So like it was a bunch of great comics, and then an hour of Joe doing his set, which was terrific as well. So it was really, it was amazing. We Francis really enjoyed it. Our producer Anton was with us. We had a great time, but we also went to New York, LA, DC and Nashville as well in one trip, and interviewed, Bill Burr, who's one of my favorite comedians ever. Sam Harris, which went a little bit viral in the last few days. People have been talking about that, and a bunch of people. I did some interviews to talk about the book. Of course, we were in New York at the Comedy Cellar. We saw Kevin Hart live, and one of the amazing things about being in the US is traveling around, meeting people as well. Is like, we didn't know how many friends and like-minded people who watch our show there are in the US. Like every city we went to, there were people coming up to us in the street saying how much they liked it, and meeting people who are doing other cool creative stuff, like our friend Chris Williamson, who runs a YouTube channel called Modern Wisdom. He's moved out to Austin. And he was there. We had a good time. We went to like a sauna and cold plunge, to the barbecue place, so it was a great trip. And now the cool thing is we've come back and we've only put out 2 of the interviews that we've recorded, and it's already like exploded massively. So we had Matt Walsh on as well, who made What Is a Woman? That was the first episode that we put out, which has done really well. Interesting reaction there.
Well, I watched.
I love talking to feminists.
I listened to part of that podcast and felt momentarily enraged, but
you did, yeah. Well, did you see me ask him about not including gender? You did.
It was great. I mean, you guys are so great. You guys are one of the only podcasts where you ask the questions where I'm like, thank you. But like I did. I thought your question.
So Megan, tell me this, right? Let's talk about this. Can we talk about this? I know you're interviewing me, but I you and I enjoy each other's company so much. Let's just have the conversation. So his argument is, Matt Walsh's argument is, look, I made a documentary. Like, who gives a shit who's in it? Like, it's about the cause, right?
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
I don't disagree with that. Like, my criticisms, and I can't speak for all feminists. Obviously, I don't think I have ever been able to speak for all feminists, and I don't think they want me to. No. But I think I've been canceled by most feminists at this point, to be honest. But I thought the movie was good. I thought it was really funny. I thought it made the point he was trying to make, which is that this is all absurd and these people can't explain their own ideology. And my issue was really mostly with the way that he was talking about women and feminists online and with respect to the documentary, because the movie came out and a bunch of gender critical feminists, whatever you want to call them, I don't use that label, but lots of the feminists who are critical of gender identity ideology use that label, criticized him for not including sort of the pioneers and these women who've been fighting this fight and like suffering for so many years, which isn't an unfair criticism. That was not my criticism. I mean, he can make whatever movie he wants. He can make whatever documentary he wants. He doesn't have to include women. He doesn't like feminists. Like he hates feminism. And, fair enough. Like, he does not have to see things their way. He doesn't have to see things my way. But what he said online was that he talked to anyone who was willing to talk to them, and that he approached a ton of these feminists and everybody refused him. And I was like, that's bullshit, man. Like, you didn't, this is what I think he didn't include feminists or feminism or these women in the documentary because he wants to present himself as kind of like a lone pioneer, the only one willing to talk about this issue, which is not true. And that he, didn't want to pay homage to people whose ideologies he doesn't like and doesn't want to promote. So I think he's sort of guilty of doing the thing that he's actually accusing other women of doing. I'm sure there are some feminists who would have refused him, but I know the vast majority of the women who are in this fight. I've known them for many years, and I know that he didn't contact me. I know that he didn't contact Posey. I know that he knows who Posey is. The Daily Wire then ripped off her woman definition t-shirt. Not that she owns the definition of woman, but, I know that he knows who I am. I've supported him before when I think he's making good commentary. Lots of his commentary I don't like at all or don't agree with at all. And I think for him to say, they all refuse to work with me is a lie. Like, I know.
Yeah, he didn't certainly didn't say that with us. He was hedging a little bit more than that with us, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, like I said in that interview with Matt, the alliance between gender critical feminists and right wing conservatives was always going to be fragile.
It wasn't going to be smooth.
And here's my theory, and I think I can't remember now because I get a shit ton of shit from everybody all the time, but I think I got a shit ton of crap from feminists for saying this. But it seems to me, at least, to check me on this theory, and if I'm wrong, I want to hear your opinion. That one of the reasons that that alliance is fracturing, and I'm not just talking about Matt Walsh specifically. I think there's a bigger thing going on than that. Is actually, in the UK, we've had a bunch of wins on this issue, and I think people are starting. It's kind of like what the metaphor I used, and it was kind of like it was the Allies towards the end of World War II, where it was kind of clear that Nazism was about to be defeated, and everybody was sort of scrapping for, who's going to get this and the credit and this. And do you see what I'm saying? Well, I think people kind of feel like, oh, we're starting to win here. Like, we don't need these guys anymore. Like, let's break the alliance that we kind of needed temporarily. And we held our noses for as long as we need to, but now we don't need to. Let's go our separate ways. Do you think there's some truth to that?
There might be. I mean, it's funny because a lot of the reason that I've been canceled by so many feminists, not just like liberal feminists, not just feminists who support trans activists, but like radical feminists, other gender critical feminists, was because they decided that I had aligned myself with the right. Right. Because I talk to all sorts of different people, because I decided to take myself out of these like ideological, political categories. And, there's right-wing people who I like, and there's right-wing people who I agree with on some issues. And I just don't care. I'm not interested in these binaries. But
burn her.
I know. I mean, it's so weird. Like, feminists are just as guilty of cancel culture as anyone. And then they're opposing cancel culture when it happens to them. I'm sure you've noticed all this. I mean, that might be a useful theory. I think probably some of it is about credit, which can sound petty, but I do get it when people have really suffered a lot, and then they're just like erased from the whole conversation in history, and they're like, oh my God, I've been trying to talk about this and get people to hear me on this, and then this man walks in and gets all the credit. Like, it is maddening. But I think that probably some feminists are like, we don't like him. We don't want anything to do with him. He's a right-wing guy. We don't even want to hear from him on this. He should shut up on this, blah, blah, blah. That's not my perspective. My perspective is, I think it is fair to give credit where credit's due and not pretend as though feminists did nothing or really just fucked this up, which he did kind of imply on Twitter, that he's like, all feminists have done has been to screw this up. And I don't think that's true.
No, it's not true, because the label of feminist is so broad that it includes people who who definitely had nothing to do with it. I would say, though, liberal feminism absolutely contributed to this particular thing. Once you start to you invent concepts like gender, then you're starting to put the pieces in place for other people to then misuse, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the problem is, like most words nowadays, you have to be very careful about what you mean. And the term feminist is so broad now that you include a bunch of people who had nothing to do with it. You also include, when we had Kathleen Stock on Triggernometry, her and I had a bit of a, back and forth about this, because I do think there were some feminists who absolutely laid the groundwork for this shit. There's no question in my mind that they did. And they created the weapons that then got used against, quote unquote, them, and a lot of other feminists who had nothing to do with it.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm saying feminist, but I've even tried to stop identifying myself as a feminist because
why is that?
Well, because of what you say. Like, what does that mean?
Right.
Like, people identify as feminists all over the place. Like, Justin Trudeau thinks he's a feminist, and I shouldn't use the word hate, but I really, really, really don't like Justin Trudeau. I think he's been screwing up Canada big time. And I think he's a giant phony. But, like, nobody knows what that means anymore. So I think it's better to just say what you mean. Like, I think it's much more productive to just talk about ideas and policy and opinions. And
it's a great approach, I think. So, absolutely.
And you're right, it is. Like, I think that the gender critical feminists get defensive when people say this is the fault of the feminists, and they're like, no, we've been fighting this. And it's like, fine, you've been fighting this, but in many ways this is the fault of the feminists, because when these ideas around gender came out of gender studies, like they came out of gender theory, they came out of third wave feminism, which is modern feminism, like it or not. I don't like it, but that is the reality. Yeah,
it's true. It's true. Well, look, the good thing is, we like I said, I think we're making progress here in the UK. With the Tavistock getting shut down, now thousands of people are suing. That's thousands of people too many for my liking, of course, because they of what they went through. But it feels to me like we're making progress on this issue. And I, as you know, have always said this will be the issue that destroys this rampant nonsense. Because, when you start to mess with people's children, when you start to mess with reality at this sort of basic level, you're gonna create a pushback. And fortunately, in the UK, we have. From what I understand, though, in the United States, it's not anything like that yet. So we'll wait and see.
Yeah, it's true. I think that we are coming around, and it's in the way that many people predicted, and it's really unfortunate because it's about kids' bodies and lives having been destroyed, and now people are suing over it. And I think we're going to see that in Canada and in the US also. I want to talk about your book.
An Immigrant's Love Letter to Transgenderism.
Exactly. I'm sure you're probably like sick of talking about it because you've had to do so much publicity around it, but it's a very good book. And I mean, part of what's really interesting about the book and about your perspective is that you're an immigrant and you came to the West, and as a result, how great the West is. And progressives have this strange habit, and I was guilty of this for the bulk of my life, so I should just be like transparent about that, of pretending as though America is the worst place in the world. I grew up in Canada. I actually have dual citizenship. I've never lived in America before, but half of my family is American. My mother is American. And, we behave as though America is the most evil place in the world. And today people behave as though America is the most racist place in the world, as though their economic system, as though capitalism is the worst system in the world. And firsthand that that's not true. And I wonder if you can just talk a bit about what you remember about the Soviet Union before you came to the UK.
Well, one of the things I talk about in the book is I really try to steelman the pro-socialist, pro-communist argument. And I talk about how the Soviet Union was actually a progressive utopia in many ways. Wealth and income inequality was very low. If you're a woman, you actually had pretty good equality by the standards of the time. You had ample maternity support. For example, when I was born, almost immediately, my mum was a student. She was very young, and there was a state-funded creche that I went to, and then kindergarten and school. All of this was funded by the state. Healthcare, universal healthcare, the problem that Americans often talk about. We had that. The streets were safe. It was an interesting society in many ways. The problem is that all of these great achievements of communism and socialism were, they had trade-offs. And the trade-offs were, first of all, you had to kill about 50 million people to make it happen. And when we talk about things like wealth and income inequality, yes, everybody was equal in that they were equally poor. Yes, everyone had universal healthcare, but if you actually wanted proper healthcare, you needed to give bribes and have connections. Similar with education, you were actually paid to go to college, paid to go to university, which was incredible. But then the state would decide how and where you would work afterwards. So it was a very different society. One of the examples I give in the book is, and this was true even in Russia until I think fairly recently, and maybe even still the case in some places today, you did not control the heating in your own home. It was centrally provided. Is that not an incredible thing?
It's crazy. So it's like you're hot. There's nothing you can do about it. There's cold.
Yeah, like if the government turns on the heating in the middle of, in September and it's like boiling, well, that's what you get. And if for some reason it turns it off in February and it's still absolutely freezing, well, that's your problem as well. But it kind of just gives you a sense of the level of interference in day-to-day lives of normal people that you had. And of course, not only was it poor, he was also extremely poor in terms of access to variety of whether that was food, toys, clothes, etc. So an interesting contrast. When I was a student, I had a job, and the guy who I worked for, he told me about his experience of being in East Berlin in the late 80s. And my dad was in East Berlin in the late 80s as well. So they were there at the same time. Right. And my dad's experience was that East Berlin was a place where you could get anything. You could get jeans, you could get candy, you could get this or that. It was incredible. And he came back. And anyone who ever managed to leave the Soviet Union and go somewhere and come back, even if they had very little money, they would bring back like everything. They would bring back like 20 pairs of jeans and trade them for stuff when it was incredible. My bosses, who was a Western guy who was in East Berlin at the same time, he was telling me about how poor and barren the shelves were in the shops in the same place. Do you see what I'm saying? So the Western guy thought he was like totally crap and lacking in basic things. And my dad, who'd come from the Soviet Union, thought it was a place of incredible abundance and opportunity and all of that. So that's how not just poor, but deprived of basic goods. Like Russian Soviet women didn't really know what tampons were until the Soviet Union collapsed. Sanitary products, washing machines were largely not available. So it was quite a difficult, having a car, like, you could almost everybody in the Soviet Union could afford the money it took to buy a car, but you couldn't buy a car because you had to wait in a line for like 10 years. I don't know if you remember, I think it was Ronald Reagan. He was fond of telling this joke about how a guy in the Soviet Union goes to buy a car, and the shop attendant says, no problem. So it will be delivered to you 10 years from now on November the 3rd. And the guy goes, morning or afternoon? and he goes, well, what does it matter? And he said, well, it's because the plumber is coming in the afternoon. You had to wait for everything, even if you had the money. That's how incredible it was. So it was a very interesting society, a very unusual one, one that most people haven't experienced. So when people talk about, the West is this or capitalism is that, I actually have something to compare it to. As you know, one of the other things I tried to do in an immigrant's love letter to the West is compare not only geographically, but also historically. When we talk about these very difficult issues in the West, like slavery or racism or whatever, we always think of them sort of, we're comparing the current situation against some sort of imagined utopia that only exists in our heads. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about slavery, for example, what we even mean by slavery is essentially purely ironically, a Western-centric view of that issue. We're talking about the transatlantic slave trade, the trade to take African slaves from Africa to the Americas, right? But at the very same time, Arab slave traders were taking African slaves out of Africa through the trans-Saharan slave trade, where the death rate was higher. It was more slaves over a longer period of time, and only ended because the Western colonial powers forced those nations to do it. And my ancestors in the Russian Empire were slaves at exactly the same time. They were serfs. So rather than being some kind of uniquely evil thing that the West, unleashed on the world, it was actually universal. And the only thing that really makes the West's, behavior in that respect remarkable is, well, the West had two things, really. The first is the West had more advanced technology. It was able to transport people in large ships across oceans, which other nations were unable to do at that time. And the other thing is, we're the first people that ended slavery. No one wants to really look at it that way, but that is what happened. So as we reckon with these very difficult legacies, I think it's really important to understand the geographical and historical context of all of the things that we like to talk about, whether it's, the treatment of women in our society, whether it's wealth and income inequality, whether it's, race and racism and slavery, whether it's any of these other issues that are so important to some people to talk about nowadays. They all have a historical and geographical perspective that is so often lacking. And I think one of the reasons, as I think you alluded to, is when your only experience of life is life in the West, when your only experience of these issues is these issues in the context of the West, it makes it very, very difficult to understand what's actually the case. I mean, in Russian, we have the saying, everything is understood in comparison. I remember I was once having a conversation with a comedian who's very big into, the racial conversation. She's originally from Kenya and she went through terrible things there. And we were having a conversation in which I was attempting to communicate to her that, there's a context to what she's talking about. And she was like, well, I don't know anything about this. I'm interested in this. And it's kind of like, well, you can't really understand, and I think part of the problem with progressivism is we sort of, everything now, we sort of compare it to what we imagine in our heads the world should be like. And we've forgotten something quite simple and obvious to me, which is that there's human nature. Mm-hmm. And human nature means that all of these problems will always exist. Like people go, we must eliminate whatever it is, racism, sex, let's say it's sexism. We must eliminate sexism. And I agree, sexism is something we should attempt to get rid of. But we can't eliminate murder. We can't eliminate rape. We can't eliminate all, climate. Like there's all sorts of stuff we can't eliminate because we're human beings. The human condition means that we are imperfect by the very nature, and therefore the societies we build are going to be imperfect. And some people are going to be psychopathic. Some people are mentally ill. Some people will want to cheat the system in order to get what they want. Some people will have a life experience that means that they're hateful. Like all of these things exist, and you're never going to eliminate them. And by the way, the thing that worries me is not just that you'll never eliminate, but you could argue you could eliminate murder. You could just put every man between 18 and 45 in prison. Well, you're smiling. The feminist in you is smiling. Old habits die hard. That doesn't
make me happy, believe it or not.
I'm kidding. I know. I'm just messing with you. I'd
be lonely.
Exactly. But you could do that, right? And then you would probably eliminate most of the murder outside of prison that happens in society. Yeah, right. But we don't do that because we understand that there's trade-offs. There's a level of risk and there's a level of problem that we're prepared to accept, because we understand that solving the last 3% of the problem means you have to do tyranny at a level that we are uncomfortable with. And that's my worry with this progressive mentality, is that if you believe that, we must eradicate these things, inequality, racism, sexism, whatever, you're going to be prepared to do quite dangerous and dark things in order to try and do that. And I think we should stay away from that, particularly as someone who comes from a society that went, yeah, let's eliminate inequality. And it turns out you've got to kill, 50 million people to make it happen.
Right. Yeah, I think that you're exactly right, which is that the left, and again, this is speaking as somebody who came from the left, and I'm reflecting back on my own politics and ideologies and what I advocated for. We're looking to create this ideal world, and we aren't looking at the reality, and I don't think we really understand the reality. And that, it's not a bad thing to want to create a perfect world where there's no violence and no inequality and no racism and no
unless you're willing to use violence to make it happen, right?
Well, right.
Right.
Then exactly. And then you get to this point where you're defending the means to an end, and then things get really dangerous. And I think we're seeing that happen right now. Quite.
And that's the worry for me, because, as you say, we'd all like society to be better and healthy in many ways. But I think I remember Jordan Peterson talking about this once. It's kind of like, in order to solve the first 95% of the problem, you can kind of do it with pretty moderate means, with a low level of investment of resources, with a bit of sophisticated thinking about how the problem should be solved. But the last 5%, you have to just go all out on the tyranny, all out on the money, all out on the all sorts of interference in people's behavior. And so I think one of the big problems we have with this, the mindset that you're describing, that you used to share, is it in my opinion, it's an extremist mindset. It's an absolutist mindset. It's a utopian mindset, and utopias never work out. And the people who pursue utopias end up usually killing quite a lot of other people in order to create that perfect world, because people are not perfect. People are not perfect. And the sort of like social justice activists should be the first ones to realize this, because they're really not perfect. You know what I mean? Like, right. if you look at their lives, usually they're not people who are happily married with 3 kids in a nice house, and their lives are generally not all that good quite often. You know what I mean?
Totally. I've seen it firsthand, man. Like the people who come and protest my events are, and I'm not saying this to be mean. To me, they're mentally ill. Like, they're very unhealthy people in mind, body, and soul.
Right. And I have every compassion and empathy for them. I just don't think they should be in charge of society.
Yeah, perhaps not the right people to be determining, policy and practice, or ethics for that matter, because I don't see their behavior as being ethical in any way at all.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No, I agree with you completely. I was just going to say, so when I was writing the book, I wasn't really sort of trying to reach those people, because, when we were on Joe Rogan, he sort of said, well, people are so balls deep in this ideology. How are you going to get them out? And I was like, you can't. They're like ISIS, and I'm not comparing social justice activists to terrorists. I'm not saying they are terrorists. I'm saying in their idea, they are as committed to their worldview as ISIS are to theirs, right? You're not going to get them to come out of it. What we have to do is win over the sensible people in the middle. And by the way, as you know, I talk in the book about, some of the ways that our societies are creating more of these people. The housing crisis here in the UK, for example, like having just had a kid myself, I can see the grounding effect that has on you. Like the thing that a child teaches you very, very quickly is like, whatever bullshit you have in your head and theories, like you try that out and it doesn't work, you find out very quickly, and the punishment is immediate. You know what I mean? Like, you can have all sorts of cool theories about how a child should be treated, but the moment you try it and it doesn't work and the child is screaming, you got to try something else, right? So it has this grounding effect on you in that sense. And also, you're responsible for someone else. It means that your focus of attention becomes less internal. It's more external. and how are people supposed to, settle down if they can't buy a house, if they can't buy a flat? So in some ways, we've got problems with the capitalist system that I do think is still the best thing that's available, but it can be improved, of course, that are creating young people who feel, that they don't have a stake in the future. And I kind of don't blame them. The average age for buying a house in the UK is well into your 30s now. I think probably into your late 30s at this point. My wife and I bought our first flat, a very small one, even though we're both, fairly successful people in our careers, at the age of 35, So it's not easy to, I always say this to conservatives because, I have my arguments with conservatives and the left always. And I'm like, well, how do you expect people to be conservative if they've got absolutely nothing to conserve? So that's part of it as well. So I was trying to reach the kind of sensible people in the middle and not so much the extremists, because I think, a lot of people are, most people will just go along with whatever they're supposed to go along with. Like, if there's a big thing about how we must all put a black square on Instagram, people will be like, well, okay. People will be bullied into it. People will be encouraged into it. People will feel like, well, I'm part of something and it's given me some kind of meaning to do this. And I think it's important that we create an alternative narrative to that, which is, yes, that we've got problems in the West, but here's a bit of historical and geographical context that helps you to see it in a more balanced light.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a bit more about capitalism because, you talk about this in your book. It's not, there's a lot of problems with capitalism. It's definitely not a perfect system. There is a lot of exploitation that goes along. There's a lot of people who are very, very rich and people who are poor. And so the criticisms of capitalism do make sense in a lot of ways. But when you compare to other systems, I think it's hard to see any other way forward. It's hard to choose a better system. Can you talk about that? I know you talked about Venezuela as an example.
Well, right. And, France's mum, as you probably know, is from Venezuela. Mm-hmm. Soviet Union wasn't all that different. The problem is, in many ways, was it E.O. Wilson who said, I think it was E.O. Wilson who said that socialism is a great idea for the wrong species. We are a selectively collaborative species. We're not like ants who all live in a colony and they're all genetically related, and therefore they're happy to not be able to reproduce themselves and only for one or two of the individuals to do it for them because they share genetics. And so they're happy to pass their genes on through somebody else because they all share. Mole rats are the same, right? They're all related to each other. Human beings aren't like that. We are selectively collaborative and first and foremost tribal. We are competitive. We want to do better. This is one of the reasons that when we talk about the problems with capitalism, we will always have quote unquote poor people. And that's not because we will never reach a level of material satisfaction that is sufficient for people to be content. It's because we define poverty in relative terms, right? Some of the poorest people in Britain are infinitely wealthier than the vast majority of the world. But their experience of life is that of being a loser in a society in which there are winners. Mm-hmm. So this idea that my point is you're never going to get a perfect system because human beings, coming back to that point, are not perfect. Human beings are fallible. This is something, again, Joe and I talked about a little bit. I'm a huge fan of Thomas Sowell, and I read a lot of the stuff that he's written. Are you familiar with his work?
I've not read any of his books, but I'm familiar with him, yeah.
Yeah, you've seen, like everybody, we've seen a lot of YouTube videos of him talking about his books, right?
Right.
So one of the things that he talks about is he wrote several books. One of them was called A Conflict of Visions, and another one was called The Vision of the Anointed. And what he basically talks about is there are essentially two visions of human society, and one of them is what he calls the constrained vision, and the idea is that human beings are imperfect, they're fallible, they make mistakes, they're irrational, they're illogical, and not perfectible. They cannot be perfected. They can be, you can play with it, and you can change this, but you might get this outcome on the other end, right? And this is something we've explored a lot on the show in recent months. The sexual revolution, we had Louise Perry. I don't know if you're familiar with her.
I interviewed her recently.
Yeah, well, we love Louise. I think she's absolutely fantastic and a really important voice in this conversation. And she talks about how there's no such thing as progress, really, no such thing as the idea that we're moving forward, because when you move in this direction, you lose something else that you had. So this is kind of the constrained vision. Like, you can mess with relationships between men and women, and technologically, that's kind of what happened in the 60s. You invent this new technology that allows people to have sex without the same consequences as before, and that changes the family unit, and that changes how kids are brought up. And I would argue that's a lot of where you get identity politics from, because you have generations of people growing up without fathers and blah, 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 right? So the point being, you can mess with the system, but people are still flawed, and you're going to get all sorts of unintended consequences when you play around with this stuff. And the unconstrained vision that Sol talks about is progressivism, is, human beings are infinitely perfectible. We just got to tweak a little bit more and use a little bit more force, or use a little bit more tyranny, and then we will get the perfect person, Homo Sovieticus, as we had in the Soviet Union, a new man or woman, right? A new person that we will create out of thin air. And the truth is, the unconstrained vision is bullshit. It just is. Human beings are not perfectible. And so the consequences of trying to mess around with this stuff will sometimes create negative outcomes. And so when we talk about capitalism and people being exploited, there's no question that capitalism has downsides. And by the way, some of them can be improved. They absolutely can be, because the housing crisis is not the result of just reality just being that way. It's a result of corruption. It's a result of people with power attempting to hold on to more power, and the politicians not wanting to challenge those concentrations of power and so on. So they can be improved. However, it is the best system that's been tried. And so my argument is evolution, not revolution, because revolutions usually have ugly outcomes, and they're followed by counter-revolutions. This is one of the other things we talked about with Louise Perry. The backlash against some of the stuff that we have seen in the last 10, 15 years, it should worry people, because, if you are like you and I think, somewhere in the middle trying to find a sensible way forward, you got to see that one of the responses to the excesses of progressivism will potentially be could be is what I mean, could be a right-wing backlash when we sort of get the Bible thumping, women back in the kitchen, that sort of point of view back in the conversation, where I'd rather it wasn't the case,
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm seeing that happen already, where people are like, well, this is bad, so we should go back to what we had before, which, I absolutely don't think is the right approach. I'll see a lot of people, women and men alike, arguing that essentially women's place really is in the home, as wives, as mothers. And there's nothing wrong with being a wife and a mother, but I do not desire to be a mother. I never have. I don't want to be confined to the home. I want to be out in the world and public life and having adventures. And I just, the risk is that we go from this binary where it's like, being a mother is bad, being a wife is bad. Like we should be completely equal. Men and women are the exact same, and anything that's feminine is bad. And go back to the complete opposite, where we go back to these like traditional sexist norms that were quite oppressive to women.
Right. Well, and the answer, I think, is not to go back to the extreme, but also to stop being dishonest too. And because the truth is, for most women, on average, it's not that their place is in the home, but they will find a lot of fulfillment in the stuff that relates to, being maternal, looking after kids. There will be other people like you who couldn't give a shit about that and don't want that. And the problem is, you shouldn't be told that you are wrong and bad for not wanting that. And women who want to have kids and want that to be the sole focus of their life, and who are brilliant mothers and are bringing up the next generation, which I really do think is an important thing, whether you personally want to have kids or not, they should also be encouraged to do that, as opposed to being demonized, by the way, mostly by other women, So that's really all that I think we need. Is we just need to be honest and say, look, there are average differences between men and women. And on average, men will tend to do this more and find fulfillment. And this is how men work. And this is how their brains tend to work on average. And for women, it's like this. But this is not prescriptive. If you see a woman on the street, it's more likely than not that she might be interested in kids. But it doesn't mean you've got to put her in the kitchen making sandwiches, because that may not be what she wants. You know what I mean?
Right. And I mean, Louise Perry writes all about this in her book, and I've tried to talk about this and write about this a little bit. My friend Bridget Fedesi, who
I love
wrote,
Bridget.
Yeah, she's awesome. She wrote an article for her Substack about this, which is that, third wave feminism taught women like me and women younger than me that the route to empowerment was to behave sexually like men, that you should fight the feeling of getting attached, that you could have sex, no strings attached, that, casual sex was fun and made you feel empowered, and that, you should push back against wanting things like commitment, wanting things like marriage. And it's just not true. It's not true in any way at all. And I'm sure there's some women, I've met women who seem to enjoy casual sex, but for the most part, casual sex is not fulfilling for women. It's not safe for women. And it's emotionally unsafe. Like, it's not, it doesn't make you feel good. Like, sometimes there's no blanket approach here. Like, sometimes casual sex can be fun and fine, and you don't feel horrible and bad and like a big whore every time you do it. But more often than not, it isn't fulfilling. It doesn't make you feel good. It doesn't get you where you want. And sometimes it gets you into a real bad place, both in terms of the sexual experience, but in terms of making bad choices about the men that you bond with. Like, we've denied that sex is a bonding experience, and that, if you're having casual sex with men, and I've had this experience, like, I'm speaking from personal experience, but I also know this is true from an evolutionary perspective, because I've read about these things from that perspective as well, which is that you have sex with somebody, and then you inherently bond, and then you maybe end up in a relationship that's not good for you because you didn't make a choice. Right. You bonded with somebody because you had a sexual bond with them, thinking, oh, well, this is just casual sex. Like, this person isn't going to be my boyfriend. This person isn't going to be my husband. And
you're fighting your brain and your body the whole time. Right. And this, again, comes back to this denial of human nature. Like, your body and my body are the product of millions of years of evolution, from primitive creatures all the way through to Homo sapiens. And the entire purpose of your body is to reproduce your DNA in some way. That's what you evolved for. Now, I'm not saying you need to take that on and go and have kids immediately, but that is what we all evolved to do. And so the idea that we're going to override these mechanisms that evolved hormonally and physically and chemically in every way over millennia and millions of years, in fact, to put you where you are, just because we invented the pill and then feminism came out and said, do this. It's complete rubbish. And women are becoming disillusioned. And by the way, you say it's bad for women. I firmly believe it's bad for men as well. And I'm not super trad in my politics, but I'm super trad in my life. My wife and I met when we were 18, married at 20. She's the only woman that's ever been in my life. But I know from guys that I'm friends with that they'll go and hook up with somebody and they feel disgust afterwards. They don't feel good.
Yeah.
It doesn't make them feel good, you know. But again, society is telling them this is the thing that, you know, guys are supposed to do. So we've been in every facet of our society, we've been messing around with very basic human programming and pretending it's not there. And like you say, it's hurting me. And by the way, that piece that Bridget wrote, I just respect the fuck out of her for writing that. So courageous and beautiful. And it's exactly what I think young women, and by the way, men, also need to hear about the reality of all this stuff. And it's going to take people like you and her and others talking about the stuff that I hope will allow the next generation of women to not feel like they have to be a wife and a mother, while also recognizing that this sort of casual stuff that some of, you know, our generation went through is not going to make you happy.
Mm-hmm. And I do think that you're right. I think that it's not good for men either, in a variety of ways. I mean, I think that it's easier as a result of, you know, for evolutionary reasons, for men to have casual sex and be less affected by it, and to be more interested in casual sex with a variety of women. But I know men who've, you know, rejected relationships and chosen, you know, Tinder and pornography and strip clubs and casual sex. And the reasons that they reject relationships are sad reasons. You know, they're afraid of being vulnerable and they're afraid of being hurt. And, you know, they want to feel in charge of their life and they don't want to be rejected. And those men, to me, seem like sad men. Like, those are often men who have like other issues with addiction, and you're trying to fill a hole. Like, having casual sex perpetually is not going to be fulfilling and satisfying for anyone in the long term.
No, I agree completely. And so that's why, you know, even though for guys it's like a high status thing, like being a slut's bad, being a stud is grey, or whatever the saying is. I actually never really particularly bought into this worldview. I never thought this is a way to be happy. And the fulfillment that you get from being in a healthy relationship with your partner or your spouse is so much greater, in my opinion, than anything that I can even imagine. Like, look, as a guy, you know, Bill Burr has all sorts of, you know, routines about what being a guy is like. You know, your dick is 24/7. Do it, fucking do it. That's how your brain is. But I just never thought that even the most sort of like exciting scenario of having sex with lots of different, it just wasn't as appealing to me as what I have in terms of the relationship, you know, now children, etc. So I think you're right. And I just think when we had this idea that we must be as free as possible, we forgot that the purpose of freedom is to pursue the things that make you happy. Freedom for its own sake is not a value. The freedom to be just free to do stupid shit that hurts you is not really that valuable. So I think freedom is important, but then we've got to also remember what it's for. What are you trying to be free to do? And to me, the reason I value the freedom of the West, which is why I wrote the book, is I want to be free to pursue the things that make me happy, to say the things that I believe, to express my opinions, to engage in interesting conversations with people without somebody telling me what I'm supposed to think. You know, I talk in the book, as you know, about where political correctness comes from. People think it's this brilliant new thing. It was created in the Soviet Union, and the purpose of political correctness was to tell people, well, look, what you're saying may be true, but it's politically incorrect. It is inconvenient to the party line. And so the reason that I'm a fan of the freedom that you enjoy and we enjoy in the West is I want to be able to say what I think. And that troubles me that we're sort of moving away from that. So yeah, freedom's great, but then you got to use it for the right thing. I agree with you that I think we've been encouraged for decades now to sort of be free. As my wife says to me, whenever I insist on doing something she doesn't approve of, you're free to be as stupid as you like. Like we've spent decades being free to be as stupid as you like, as opposed to being free to do the things that actually make us happy.
Mm-hmm. And I really, excuse me. I found that interesting when you talked about the history of that term, political correctness, because I didn't know that. I wonder how that term came from Soviet Russia to be mainstreamed in America.
Well, I think that it was also adopted in China under Mao later than it was in the Soviet Union. And I think there were a lot of sort of, I was going to say left-leaning, but they were outright communist and Marxist academics in the West who spread this idea through academia in as part of their worldview, and we sort of just went, oh, okay, let's take this completely foreign crap and implement it in our world for some reason. And of course, another big part of it since then is we've invented social media, which is very good for propagating ideas that are bad but sound good, right? On social media, bad ideas that make you feel good, they get spread. Whereas if you come in and go, well, actually, the world's not perfect. We're never going to be able to eradicate racism. Let's just accept the fact that we're making lots of progress. And, every now and again, something bad will happen. We have to accept it. We'll do our best to remedy it. But that's about as good as you're going to get. That's not going to get a lot of likes and retweets. You know what I mean? No, that's going to get you condemned as someone who supports racism or whatever it is. So, we've got a few different things coming together. And as I say, we had a woman on the show called Mary Eberstadt who wrote a book called Primal Screams, How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. And this is one of the things that she talked about. When you have generation after generation of people growing up in what we used to politically incorrectly call broken homes, in other words, an unstable family environment in which both parents are not available to give the child what they need, you're going to have generations of people who feel angst, a sort of feeling that life is, that there's something wrong with the world, and they're going to go out and find things that are wrong in the world and project their own internal trauma onto those things and say, yes, finally, the reason I feel bad inside is that I saw this clip of a black man being badly treated. And that's why I feel terrible when I'm at home by myself. That's why I hate my dad. That's like all of this stuff. It gives people this sort of explanation for their internal confusion and trauma and the tension that they feel inside and the nihilism towards the world. So we've got a few things coming together right now, which is why I think we've had these issues for a few years now.
Yeah, I mean, people often will use politics as an excuse for their personal issues, I think. I hear people say all the time that, like, well, of course I'm depressed, or of course they're depressed because, climate change, the world's burning, everything's going to shit. Or, like, we live in a racist country. Like, of course I can't cope. Of course I can't move forward. Of course I can't succeed. And I don't know if people really think that all the way through, but they surely like saying it.
Well, right. And I think, that's why I'm someone who's been really, in my life, very big into personal development and resolving problems that I have, because we all have stuff that we have from childhood. It's been really important to me because I want to come to the world with a cleaner a set of spectacles as I can in terms of how I perceive it. And by the way, my willingness to stand up and say what I think is a product of my childhood. Like my dad, who I love and we have a great relationship now, but he was a bit of a bully when I was a kid. So when I was a teenager, it was I always say it's like it was a unstoppable force, meets a movable object. Yeah. I was that kind of kid. Does it sound familiar?
Oh, yeah, exactly. I mean, I came from, I'll let you finish.
No, go for it.
I came from a family that was, I didn't have much choice. It was, my parents were authoritarian. They were also, quite progressive people. My mother was a feminist. My dad was a Marxist. And there's lots of good things that I got from my parents and learned from my family. But growing up, I didn't have a say about anything. So I had to fight. I had to fight and fight and fight for everything that I wanted. I had to fight to speak, I had to fight for my freedom my whole life. And so I have noticed as an adult, as I reflect back, that, you know, because people will often ask me, and they probably ask you things like this as well, like, how do you have it in you to, you know, do this? And I'm like, I can't not speak the truth if I think it's important. It's really important to me to talk things through, and to, you know, be honest about my own thoughts and feelings, not constantly. I have boundaries too, but going around being like, I feel weird. But, you know, like I'm a fighter because I've always kind of had to be.
You had to be, right? And so, but I suppose what I'm saying is that is our childhood experience. But I think, and every human being is going to be shaped by the genetic makeup and the experiences they go through life. And I think the job of a human being, if you want to evolve past your childhood shit, is to process it in such a way that it becomes healthy. So, for example, when I was 20 years old, my wife would say, do this, and I would never do it because I was just like, you're not telling me what to do. Like, don't tell me what to do was a thing that I carried. It was like a shield that I carried around in front of me and shoved in everyone's face.
Yeah.
That's not healthy. But over time, what you learn is, okay, it's great to have a shield because there's some assholes who will come and tell you what to do. And you got to stand up and say, no, actually, I'm not bowing to this mob. I'm not bending the knee. I'm not going to do this. But also when your wife, who loves you and has a perspective on you that you yourself lack, comes and says, baby, well, have you thought about this? Maybe that's not the time to use the shield, right? And so you learn over time that every tool has a context, and the shield is a tool you can use in certain contexts, and it served me very well in my life and in my career. But I also have to be able to put it down and listen to people tell me how my behavior makes them feel. I have to be able to hear their input, and I've got to learn, first of all, to be able to hear it, and then, even more importantly, to be able to make my own decision at the end of it, without either being triggered by them telling me what to do, or by being like, well, they said this, then I've got to do that, right? So I've got to be able to process what they've said. I've got to be able to set the shield aside and then make my own decision. And that's the journey of a human being.
Right. Yeah. Recognizing your triggers, recognizing when you're being triggered, not just reacting, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, that's something that I've learned that's really important too. You said here, actually, let me find, I think I put the quote here somewhere, but you talked about how important it is to listen and talk to other people. I think you said, like, this is how you learn, by listening and talking to other people. And, you know, I feel really blessed, actually, because of the work that I do. You know, I've been doing these podcasts for so many years. I don't do a ton of journalism anymore, but I have done a lot of journalism in my life. And so I've had the benefit of talking to so many different people, and I've completely changed my mind about all sorts of things as a result. I've learned so many things. And, you know, I've realized that a lot of people don't have that opportunity. A lot of people are siloed, and often they self-silo. You know, people are way too willing to excommunicate friends and family who think differently than they do. And they, you know, read their Facebook feeds, and they pay attention to the media that tells them what they want to believe. And they keep a relatively small friend group of people who are like them. And I think they don't realize what they're missing.
I agree. I think to me, certainly in terms of my intellectual life, the engagement with ideas that are different to my own has been really important. And look, as you get older and you process more and more ideas, you become a little bit clearer on what you think. And so perhaps the range of ideas where you are prepared to entertain an alternative does shrink over time. Like, there are certain, like, there is nothing you could say, at least nothing I've ever heard, that could persuade me that the West is the most racist place in the world, right? I've studied that issue pretty thoroughly, I am pretty confident in saying that is not the case, right? But there are lots of things about which I'm completely unsure, and I'm really interested in hearing a different opinion. And, hearing someone's opinion may not change your mind, but it may give you a slightly more nuanced perspective on things. For example, yes, the West isn't the most racist place in the world, but there are people who experience a lot of discrimination, and there are problems in some communities with that. And it's often only by speaking with some of those people that you really get to understand it. So we've always got to keep our ears open, I think, and listen to people. And to me, most of all, it's enriching. I like listening to people, even with whom I profoundly disagree. And I think if I can say this, it's probably part of the success of Triggernometry is that that's what me and Francis like to do. We like to listen to people who have a different idea. It's frankly what we do when we sit around in the studio with the three of us, me, Francis, and Anton, and we throw out an idea, whether that's something from philosophy or whether that's who's the best soccer player at the moment. And we'll have a debate, and we'll all deliberately take opposing positions just because we like to piss each other off. And then we'll go at it respectfully and come to some sort of understanding or a willingness to agree to disagree or whatever. And that's the fun of life. I don't want to be surrounded. Like the three of us all voted for different political parties at the last election. Like that to me is interesting. We've got a bunch of people that work for us, a bunch of staff now. They've all got their own perspectives. We have a trans guy that works for us. We have a woman with gender dysphoria that works for us. We have a guy from a Sikh background. We have a Scottish guy, a Welsh guy. Like we've got a bunch of different people, all with different points of view politically and culturally and whatever. And that's what makes it, a lot of fun and very interesting. So, it's ironic that the very people who talk about diversity so much are actually deeply uninterested in diversity of ideas. I am really interested in diversity of ideas, and I could not give a shit what's between your legs and what your skin color is.
Yeah. The idea that the West is the most racist in the world is so stupid. It is so stupid. And people believe it so certainly. I know that I have friends back in Vancouver that if I said, actually, like the West is really not a very racist place, the West is doing really good on that end, they would be like shocked and appalled.
Right.
And like if you go to third world countries, racism is horrible. Like racism is way worse in these countries where the people of color live, who progressives in the West think that they're defending from racism. Like in Mexico. And most of that racism is about class too. That's the other thing that people in the West or
like most of the racism in the West, by the way, right? Most of the stuff that people talk about when they talk about systemic racism, they're just talking about basically poor people. Poor people have a shit life. Yeah, we knew that. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. The people who get the shit deal tend to be the people with darker skin, and it's about class. It's about discriminating against poor people. It's about rich people, high class people, discriminating against poor people, and often those people are the more indigenous people. But it doesn't always work that way.
Well, but there will be, particularly certainly in the UK, because they're more recent immigrants. It takes generations to build wealth. It takes generations to establish yourself as part of a society. And by the way, even that analysis is kind of bullshit, because Indians, West Africans, Chinese, Japanese, they kick white people's asses all over the place when it comes to education, income, whatever you want to call it. So even that narrative isn't even accurate. It's really about certain groups who have a certain historical experience. They're a little bit behind or a lot behind, depending on who they are. And if we treated people not on their skin color, but on the problems that they're facing, the actual problems, the fact that there's a shit ton of crime in their neighborhood, the fact that there's not enough fathers in the homes in their neighborhoods, the fact that, there's not enough jobs in those neighborhoods because of the crime, etc., then we would have a completely different conversation that would actually help those people. But no, some people have decided that we got to play the stupid tribal game. And so that's the game we're playing.
Yeah. I mean, even in Vancouver, it was so amusing to me to watch Vancouver have like a BLM rally during COVID because you can't get COVID from racism. So like they're like fighting the good fight, so they're protected from COVID, but the people who were protesting the COVID measures were shut down, right? And terrible, dangerous fascists who are spreading their germs around. But anyway, like it's the demographics in Vancouver are, I mean, mostly white and then South Asian. And actually one of the big issues with the housing problem in Vancouver, which is that nobody can afford to rent anything in Vancouver. Nobody can afford to buy anything in Vancouver either, but rents are through the roof and it's super competitive. But at the same time, there's hundreds of thousands of condos in Vancouver that are just sitting empty because people from Asia have bought them as investments or as somewhere to keep their money, but they don't want to rent them out. And that's a really racist thing to say. But it's just, I mean, my main point is that there's no like white people versus POC situation in Vancouver, although people really pretend real hard that there is.
Yeah, well, it gave people, like Sam Harris said in our interview, one of the things that didn't go viral, but actually was a very good point is, so many people lack meaning now. And fighting racism, it's a great cause, isn't it? It makes you feel so good, and gives you so much meaning in your life. That you're this moral person that's standing up against it. You're Martin Luther King, you and Gandhi and all of those things on your computer just typing, So yeah, it gives a lot of people a feeling like they're doing the right thing. And I hope we can get past that. And that's why I read the book. I want to persuade people that there's a better way of doing these things.
I do want to talk to you about the Sam Harris interview because there was a clip that went viral. And because I on my Patreon, I asked if people had questions that they wanted me to pose to you. And one of the questions was about that clip. And so his question, I'm going to paraphrase a bit because it will be sort of my question also. Well, he says Konstantin and Francis just did an insane interview with Sam Harris, whereby Harris went all in on Trump derangement syndrome. But my impression was that Sam Harris essentially argued that it was justified to suppress speech and information for political aims. And he's been real caught up in anti-Trump stuff for so long that I have been a bit turned off by that, I'll be honest. But is that the impression that you got from him? And what did you think about his arguments? Because he's clearly a really, really smart guy, but there seems to be a bit of a block there.
Well, it was my impression that he believes that shutting down the spreading of certain information for political purposes is legitimate. That's what he believes. I think it's very clear from the way that we had the conversation that I don't share that view. I can't speculate as to why he thinks that way. I think, even very intelligent people still have emotions and respond to them. And sometimes the more intelligent you are, the more difficult it is to recognize when you're being emotional as opposed to rational. Sometimes if you're trained from a very young age to be rational all the time, you then almost are forced, because emotions are not a legitimate reason for doing something in your mind. You are then forced to cloak your emotional reasoning in this sort of veneer of rationality. Right. Yes. So I don't know whether that's happening with Sam or not, but I know that I sometimes do that, as someone who comes from a family of scientists, and therefore, emotion isn't really a good reason to do anything, but it's rational. Everything has to be rational. And it's very easy to pretend that, the fact that I don't like someone is because rationally I've looked at the facts and whatever, when I just don't like them because they're a dick, or whatever. So that could be it. But yeah, I disagree with Sam about that thing. I also thought in the rest of the interview, he said lots of really interesting things, and he was right on a lot of stuff as well. But yeah, I mean, that's the purpose of Triggernometry. You would bring people on who have different opinions, and like I always say, remember, kids, it's called Triggernometry for a reason.
Exactly. I mean, I wonder if you have any ideas about why and how people get stuck in terms of, people get these kinds of blocks in all sorts of contexts, from climate change to, feminism to racism. I just mentioned earlier that I'm sure there's a number of things that I could say to my friends in terms of, questioning their hyperbolic, paranoid fears about climate change, for example, or their hyperbole around the extent of, racist police violence in the US, where they would probably be shocked to hear anyone say that and put up a wall. Why is it that you think that people get so very attached to their beliefs without any real good reason to be? Most of these people, it's obvious they haven't really looked at the data, and they haven't really explored the topic fully. Otherwise, they wouldn't have this very, very politicized approach where they can't hear anything that challenges their view.
Well, I think the answer is, you answered your own question when you said without having a good reason. I do think they have a good reason. Very often it's a question of identity, particularly for the people that you're talking about. Their identity as a good person depends on them thinking certain things. Otherwise, they become a bad person like you and me, who are cast out of the tribe, and they know that's so. And very often I find that when you're having a conversation with somebody like that, even if you're very calm and reasonable, you can see the cogs turning, and they're going, wait, no. If what you're saying is true, then I have to believe this. And if I believe this, then I'm no longer a good person. Therefore, let's have an emotional reaction to what's being said. And I think part of it is the attachment to identity. Part of it, as I said, we live in a social media world where ideas that make you feel good, but they're completely wrong, propagate and spread very quickly. And so people buy into them. And also, particularly the left side of the political spectrum, the right has its own deformities and derangements too. But on the left, Jonathan Haidt has talked about this in his book, in several of his books, that the left in particular is much more prone to prioritizing certain things like care, and essentially it's more emotionally driven than the right. So people on the left are much more likely to not particularly care about the facts, because they care about how the facts make them feel. I have a friend who is very, very far left. He's like a member of the Green Party, blah, 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 blah. And we're good friends, and sometimes we'll talk, and he'll say like, I just think we should have open borders. And I'm like, well, look, I'm an immigrant. Let me tell you what would happen if we had open borders. And he goes, no. Look, I know it's not practical. It just makes me feel good, and that's how I want to think about it.
Right.
And that's fine. It's okay for him to think that. I just don't want him in charge of government immigration policy. That's all.
I appreciate that he admits that.
Yeah. He just like, I don't want to get into. I know that if I start looking into the facts of, I just think all human beings, and you and I can agree on this, Meghan, all human beings have value. Just because you're born in Africa or in the Middle East, you shouldn't have half our life expectancy and be bombed to shit every 3 years, and have terrorists take over your country and American drone. Like, we can all agree that everyone should live in peace and dignity and comfort and blah, 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 and ideally equality. We can all agree with that. So I understand where they're coming from. But when it comes to policy, I'd like people who are looking at the data and the facts and using reason and logic to be making those decisions, please. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we succumb. Feminists do this a lot. They succumb to be nice. I mean, unless we're talking about dealing with men.
Well, feminists using emotional
not
thinking?
be nice.
Really? No way.
Let me. Are you sitting down? Let me introduce the concept to you. No. But I think, like, and even when they're defending, you know, their own free speech, not necessarily other people's free speech, but they're defending their own free speech, but at the same time being like, but you should be nice. Like, don't be mean. Like, don't say that because it's mean. You know, I've been told many times that I should use, like, why won't you just use people's preferred pronouns? You're just being mean. And I'm like, I'm not doing it to be mean. I'm correctly sexing people because I don't want to lie. And obviously, I think it's a hugely slippery slope, and we've seen how that plays out. Like, I think there's harms and dangers to using, you know, female pronouns to refer to a man. But also, like, why do I have to lie to be nice? And the reality is that it's not good to be nice all the time. And, you know, the truth isn't always nice. And certainly jokes aren't always nice. And satire isn't nice. And like, I love this phrase that you used, which was, forget speaking truth to power. We need to speak truth to the dour. Because, you know, not having a sense of humor is like a really, really, really bad quality in a person. But we're expected to cater to those very dour people.
Right. And it's kind of funny because, you know, I'm always slightly trolling, you know, feminists because we have a lot of them who watch our show because we've obviously covered the trans issue quite a lot. And you know, some of them are absolutely brilliant, but I have to say, some of them don't have a great sense of humor. And so I'm always trolling them because you know, you're just like just... And it's particularly on Twitter, it's funny, especially when it's people who don't know who I am, so they don't really know my comedic voice. And I remember I tweeted something how, you know, when the Tavistock got shut down and all of these great things were happening, I said, you know, one of the things that these incredible wins against gender ideology in the UK show is you should never piss off a bunch of angry lesbians. And like a bunch of angry lesbians came in and started like quote tweeting. It was like, it's a fucking joke.
I know. I hate to admit it because I don't want to piss people off. I mean, obviously, I piss people off all the time. That's not true. But like, I mean, I write a lot of satire. It's my favorite thing to do. I would like to just write satire all the time. And some people love it, and some people, you know, it's probably like half and half. And some people get so mad, they take it completely literally. And then if you don't want to have to explain it's a joke when you make a joke, because it kind of ruins the joke, or be like, it's satire, I'm joking. And then I have to try to think about like how to explain satire or sarcasm, and I don't know how to do that.
Well, you can't, and you shouldn't really. This is the sad truth of it. I mean, you know, the reason a lot of comedians become comedians, it's from an evolutionary perspective, it's a way of signaling intelligence to women. That's basically right.
I didn't know that.
Oh, absolutely. That's why, particularly in the UK, I mean, most comedians are sort of beta males who would be unsuccessful with women otherwise, but because they're funny and women like men who are funny. That's why women like men who are funny, because it's a signal of intelligence.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So we've had a bunch of evolutionary psychologists on the show, and Diana Fleischman, who I love, she made this point. So I can't remember oh, yeah, right. So if it's a signal of intelligence, then it makes sense that, you know, there's a distribution of intelligence in society. Some people aren't going to get it.
I think I see what you're saying. I mean, there's obviously a big problem that you've talked about a lot, which is people trying to ruin comedy. You know, people trying to make comedy woke. And as we discussed earlier, you were just in Austin and you were super impressed by the scene there and about how free those guys were. What You've talked about there being a big problem with comedy in the UK, partly due to the fact that it's essentially controlled by one body, that it's controlled by, is it the Edinburgh Festival?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that would be an exaggeration to say that it's controlled by one body. Mm-hmm. The Edinburgh Festival is very influential for sure. And then the rest of the industry is a small number of people. But I would say that's only part of it, Meghan. The big part of it, and this is something you'll be much more familiar with, is that like in Canada, we have laws about what you are and aren't allowed to say. We have laws that say that it's illegal to be grossly offensive. You can be arrested for being grossly offensive. Mm-hmm. We had a guy, the next episode that's coming out on Triggernometry is with a guy called Harry Miller. You may remember him.
Yeah, I love him. I interviewed him maybe a year and a half or maybe even more than that ago.
Right. And as did we. But since then, he's been in the news again because he was actually arrested because he was defending a guy who was also arrested. And the reason the guy was arrested is that he shared a meme on Facebook. Right. We routinely we've had a bunch of comedians, left wing and right wing, both, and neither, investigated for jokes that they've said by the police. So, and look, I'm not saying, the Gestapo are rounding up all the comics, because they're not. But if you exist in a climate where that is the case, and the industry in which you work is controlled by people who are not just woke, they are openly woke. The lady who runs the Edinburgh Festival Awards said in 2018, I wrote a whole Substack about this recently. She said in 2018 that she looks forward to a new era of woke comedy where woke comedians will be deciding what isn't acceptable. So you've got
that. Sounds like a joke.
Right. You've got that, and you've got the laws on the books, which allow people to be prosecuted for things that they say. Put those two together, you're going to have a problem.
Can you explain what the purpose of comedy is for people who might argue that there is no purpose, and so why not regulate the shit out of it?
Well, the purpose of comedy, first and foremost, is to make people laugh, and that is to make people feel good. But one of the interesting things about the development of comedy around the world is stand-up comedy is genuinely a product of societies in which you don't have enough sun. Right. Southern Europe does not have a stand-up comedy culture. Northern Europe has a stand-up comedy culture. And the reason that you have stand-up comedy cultures in hot places like Australia and New Zealand is that they are the product of the Britain, right, which has a shit climate. As someone who lives there, I can tell you. So in the winter, this is something that's well known in the comedy industry. No one really goes to see comedy in the summer in anything like the same numbers. Like I used to run a comedy club. We would shut it down for July and August because there was no point. You couldn't sell enough tickets. So comedy is a way to give you the endorphins that you need that you would normally get by being outside in a nice climate and whatever. So the purpose of comedy, first and foremost, is to make people feel good. But also then you can go deeper into that, because the purpose of comedy is also to help people process trauma and difficult things. If you look at, who has the darkest sense of humor, it's medics, firemen, firewomen,
fire people,
Fire X, whatever, the Fire X community, police officers, etc. People who deal with horrible shit, soldiers, obviously, people who deal with horrible shit on a day-to-day basis. So it's a way of processing difficult things and making light of them and being okay with them. And the third point, and this is less about comedy, but much more about the stuff that you and I are into, which is satire. The point of satire is to prick the arrogance of the powerful and to point out the hypocrisies and the inconsistencies. I can never, ever remember who said this, but there's a big difference between comedy and satire. And that's because comedy is kind and pessimistic. That is to say, comedy accepts humanity and society and life for what it is, believes it can't be changed. It's pessimistic, and therefore it's kind. It says, look at the imperfections of all of us. Look how, I try to lose weight, but I can't. And I try to be nice, but I can't. Like, it's about accepting us for what we are and making light of it and making us comfortable with imperfection. Satire, on the other hand, which is why you and I get in trouble so much, is angry and optimistic. It believes that the world can be improved, not perfected, but improved. And it's angry that it's not perfect, but it's optimistic in that it believes that if we point out the hypocrisies and the inconsistencies, and if we mock the powerful, we can actually get to a better world and to a better place. And so that's the third point of satire, and always has been. If you look at the court jester, the point of the court jester is he was the one person that was allowed to tell the powerful king what no one else could, including to criticize the king. And if you look at, I don't know if you're a Game of Thrones fan, for example, are you?
I watched the first 3 seasons and then the last season.
Well, I don't that's an interesting approach. Yeah,
I know.
Yeah, but if you look at literature and art and things like Game of Thrones, you can see in terms of a plot device, the way you show a king going mad is when he starts to kill the jester. If you remember with Joffrey, I don't know if you got that part, right? The king goes mad when he's unable to take criticism from the jester, when he's unable to be satirized. And look at what happened in Russia. I mean, in Russia, we had no satire whatsoever of the politicians or anything like that. There was 1 or 2 exceptions, but they would never mock the powerful themselves. They would mock the system or the structures or human nature or whatever. Then the Soviet Union collapses, and under Boris Yeltsin, the first president of Russia, there's a liberalization, there's an opening up, and we have satire, we have comedians. We have a brilliant show called Kukli, which was the equivalent of Spitting Image. These are puppets of politicians, and they're made fun of, and they say ridiculous things, and it was incredible. The first thing that Vladimir Putin does when he comes to power is shut it down straight away. Dictators do not like to be satirized. They do not like to be mocked, and that is because they recognize that the power of laughter and the power of mocking in that way has the ability to influence society in that way. So 3 purposes: make you feel good, make light of difficult things, and to mock the powerful, and to change to some extent the way people look at the world.
And, this obviously connects to free speech in the ways that, Canada, Justin Trudeau and his Liberal Party have been for at least a year now trying to push through anti-hate bills and, a bill to supposedly stop hate online, which would police social media and police YouTube. And what it comes down to, from my perspective, is about preventing people from criticizing the government. Because who determines what hate is and what hate speech is?
The government.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we had in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union decided what was wrong and right, and the wrong think and right think, and then they would punish the people who had the wrong opinion. This is one of the reasons that, I wrote the book, is I am troubled by the direction of travel. And there's no question that we are adopting elements in the West of the communist society from which I come. Absolutely no question.
Yeah. I want to ask you, if you don't mind, one more question from Patreon, and then I'll wrap this up. I know that it's getting late there for you over there.
I have another interview in a bit, actually, which is the main reason I would go. But I enjoy speaking with you so much, Meghan. It's really a pleasure.
It's a long night for you then, with the no sleep and the baby. I would imagine. I'm freely nocturnal.
I go to my studio, to the workplace, because we have a space, but I have a room in our studio. I basically go to work to get sleep nowadays, so it's fine.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that you're getting some sleep.
Some.
So Andy on Patreon, asked about the war in Ukraine. This is a big question. I do know that I listened to, you and Francis did an episode that I found really, really useful in terms of explaining what was going on there, because I had no idea. I did not understand the history. I did not understand the conflict. I don't fully understand it, but it was very helpful. And so I actually would, if you have any kind of perspectives or, predictions in terms of how this war will proceed and really what's going on here, like what's the aim, what's the root of the conflict, like what's where.
Yeah, I wish you'd asked me that earlier, because it's about 2 hours worth of answers there.
We'll
So
wait until an hour and a half in and then ask you a
yeah,
complicated question.
yeah, it is a big question. So I guess I'll say the same thing I said to Joe in terms of predictions, which is very difficult to predict what's going to happen. Nobody really knows. It depends on what the West does. It depends on how effective Ukrainians are at defending themselves. It depends on what Russia does and is willing to do. Right now, the situation is that both sides are taking very heavy losses, and Russia is inching forward, but certainly nowhere near the objectives that it set for itself at the beginning. At the beginning, they tried to essentially cut half of the country off. They invaded from the north, they invaded from the south, and they invaded from the east in order to basically capture the entire center and east of the country, including the capital, Kiev, and everything to the east of that, and to reattach it in their eyes to the great Russian Empire. That's not what they've been able to do. The initial invasion failed completely, so they were not able to make. They got close to the capital from the north, but they were pushed out completely. Took a lot of losses. That's where some of those atrocities that you saw, like Bucha, with lots of people killed and raped and so on, that's where they were committed. They were pushed out of there. They have a bit of a stronghold in the south. What happened in the south is they basically, nobody knows exactly, but my understanding is the Russians were able to infiltrate the Ukrainian armed forces, and they managed to get several influential people there to commit treason and let them invade from the Crimean Peninsula, by giving them maps of minefields and so on. So they were able to get in. And because of that, they have a bit of a foothold in the south, but that is being very hotly contested now. And in the east, there is a bloodbath going on over the two regions that were already partially captured by quote unquote pro-Russian forces, as in forces supported and funded and armed by Russia in the east in 2014. And there's a bloodbath going on because what Russia would like to do is capture those areas, those two regions fully, and then go, okay, look, this is actually what we wanted. We didn't want to capture the half the country. We were protecting our people. I'm using quotation marks for all of this in the east. They're trying to get to that point. The Ukrainians are fighting very hard. A lot of the Western weaponry has been very helpful, particularly in stopping Russian tanks, in stopping Russian missile attacks, and particularly Russian planes. So Russian planes basically don't fly over Ukraine anymore, other than around the front line, because they get shot down if they do. So the Western help has been really great, and in particular, the big advantage that Russia has been in artillery. They've been using that. Russian military tactics all the way back to World War II and before have been pretty primitive, which is why the Soviet Union had such huge casualties in World War II. It was just, send a bunch of men straight at a machine gun nest. So they have an advantage in artillery, and basically their tactic has been to bombard these fortified areas in the east using their advantage in artillery. However, the Ukrainians got a lot of what are called HIMARS. These are essentially rocket launcher systems that are very effective, and Russia has no counter to them. So that means that the Ukrainians can destroy Russian command and control centers, Russian arms depots, Russian headquarters of important units, supply lines, etc., without ever being at risk of being destroyed themselves, because they outrange the Russian weaponry in that way. And artillery is extremely important in this war, much more than in any previous major war, because you have drones everywhere. So essentially there is no fog of war. You know exactly what is everywhere. And so if you know what's there and you have precise artillery, you can strike everywhere. So if you have an advantage in artillery, you're going to be very effective. And for most of the war so far, Russia had a 10-to-1 artillery advantage. However, these new weapons that the West is providing are allowing Ukraine to mitigate some of that. Both sides are taking heavy losses. Nobody knows how it's going to go. In terms of the origin of the conflict, I would invite people to go back and watch that interview that Francis and I did. It's called The War in Ukraine Explained. And by the way, I said some things in that interview that turned out to be complete bullshit, certainly about NATO being over and stuff like that. I was overly pessimistic about the Western response. It's been surprisingly strong and robust for me. Not as strong as it could be. I mean, Germany is deeply compromised by the fact that they made themselves dependent on Russian energy, because what they did, talking about the green stuff, is they went, oh, we're going to be green now. And by the way, Fukushima, the nuclear meltdown that happened there, that scared them a lot. So they basically shut down the entire nuclear industry. So they need Russian gas. And so they can't be, as robust in their response to what's happening, because they are on the needle. They're on the hook to Russia.
Yeah, that was a really helpful episode. No, go on.
Yeah, okay. So we probably don't have time to go into the full origins of the conflict. What I would recommend is people to watch that. And there's another thing that it's not mine. There is a Finnish military intelligence colonel, a retired guy. He did a lecture. We interviewed him afterwards. I would say our interview with him is less good, but the lecture, it's in Finnish with subtitles, or it's dubbed. And it is absolutely worth watching if you want to. It's an hour if you want to understand the Russian mindset, some of the ideology behind it, why Russians think the way they do, why they've done what they've done, and likely what they're going to continue to do. It's a guy called Martti Kari, and I think it's called Finnish military intelligence colonel breaks down something. Like, go and find that. That is the most interesting hour of explanation about Russia that you will ever see. And in addition to that, if you want more detail, go and watch our interview with a guy who used to be an advisor to Vladimir Putin, called Andrei Illarionov, on our channel. And he breaks down his thoughts on why Russia's doing what it's doing as well.
Okay, that's super helpful. I really appreciate you trying to summarize that.
Yeah, it's a bit of a challenge.
In this much space.
It's like if I said, explain feminism to me in a sentence, maybe.
You have 5 minutes. Do you think that there's a real risk of America losing their position as, the world's superpower to somewhere like Russia or China?
I think if we carry on spending most of our political capital and time defining what a woman is, instead of understanding what our role in the world is, then there's a risk of that. I think if people in the West continue to buy into this idea that we're the worst people ever, there's a risk of that. I think if people in the West continue to spend all their time being divided over woke bullshit, there's a risk of that. I think if we forget that it's important to have a healthy view of your society and recognize that, yes, you're not perfect, but guess what? We're a lot less racist than Russia and China. We're a lot more progressive when it comes to, in Russia, it's legal to beat your wife. Like, it's not criminalized, right? Like, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about people with a very different mindset. And we've got to make sure that we are dominant in the world. Otherwise, we're going to be living under them. This is the problem. Most people, particularly progressive people, think that, if the West stopped being so evil, everything will be fine. No. If the West stopped being the dominant force, somebody else would come in and fill that vacuum, and it's going to be either Russia or China, and you do not want to be living under them. Yes, right. Exactly. Totally. Do you know, I'm going to let you go now. Thank you so much for all your time. When are you guys going to be in Austin again? Do you know? We are hoping to come back this autumn, so fall. For you guys, and also the aim is to come back for a couple of months in sort of late January, early February, something like that, around then. So I'd love to meet you in person if you're around, and spend some time. Yeah, me too. Yeah. I'm trying to plan an event there at the end of September, and then I think I'll hopefully be back again end of October, November. And like I said, it's an easy flight, but it's like I did an event in Austin last time I was there when I did Rogan last time in June, right. and I love the city, but it's an interesting place to do events because they do have this, like, it's freer and obviously it's a red state, so it's less woke than, for example, somewhere like Portland or Seattle or Vancouver, but it's still the woke part of Austin, so there's that too. But anyway, I hope that we can connect. I would love to do that, Meghan. You're one of my favorite people on the internet. I always really enjoy our conversations. I really think people like us who are trying to chart a sensible path in the middle without becoming partisan in either direction. I think we have an important role to play. And so I always appreciate you and I, our time. And so I really look forward to meeting you. I'm sure we'll make that happen.
That's very kind. Triggernometry is one of the only podcasts I ever recommend to people all the time. I'm not saying that to be nice, but it's excellent, as everyone who listens knows. And for those who don't, they should be listening. Thank you.
Should they read the book?
Oh.
What's the book called, Meghan? You've not said the name of it once. I mean, Jesus Christ. An hour and 43 minutes I give you, and this is how... Unbelievable.
And immigrants, everyone...
This is the problem with feminists, everybody. All take, no give. Retired feminists.
It's not a problem with feminism. It's a problem with my brain.
I'm just messing with you.
No, now I feel really bad. I'm turning red. It's called An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. I can't hold it up because I don't have a copy yet, but I'm really looking forward to getting a copy at some point.
We'll get you an
audio book, which was awesome. I loved listening to you read the book, and it's such a cool book. I think that your perspective is so
that sounds
awesome.
fake now.
It's so now I'm just being nice.
No, Meghan, don't worry about it. Everybody knows what
Meghan, just be honest.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope everybody's enjoyed that chat.
I hope so too.